Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Alright, so there's one thing that I feel like has to be acknowledged right off the top with Across the Spider-Verse before I address anything else. This movie looks incredible. Honestly, I wish I had the animation know-how to be able to speak to this in far more detail, but come on, I have never seen a mainstream animated movie look like this. Into the Spider-Verse felt like a breath of fresh air in animation, and its influence can already be seen in things like the upcoming Ninja Turtles movie. But Across the Spider-Verse makes that film look like it was playing it safe in comparison. I'll probably keep touching on aspects of that throughout the video, but I do think it's this film's most notable and striking achievement. But of course, that doesn't mean I don't have plenty to say about the script and the characters. And I can't wait to get into it all here. Oh, and sorry if my audio sounds weird. I'm in a hotel traveling right now and honestly thought about taking this week off, but just could not resist talking some Spider-Man. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and you know what, let's just get into it.
Nice claws. You ever hang out with my friend Wolverine? You won't take me again.
So I have to say, as much as I loved Into the Spider-Verse, there was something about the marketing of this movie that had me a little worried. The fact that so much of it seemed to revolve around a very Rick and Morty-like Council of Spider-Men. The Spider-Verse concept is honestly something that I've kind of become more and more down on in recent years, as it feels like so many Spider-Man stories are going to that well again and again. And when you do that, I feel like you really run the risk of everything beginning to feel completely meaningless. What's the emotional impact of a character's death when there's hundreds of versions of that character running around with a dozen slightly tweaked characteristics? Honestly, I still think some of those worries are very valid, and it's an issue I have with a lot of recent Spidey stuff, but if anything makes a compelling case for the concept as a whole, it's these Spider-Verse movies. Not only is nearly every new universe we see a creative and exciting visual treat, but they also do a fantastic job of keeping everything very focused on the emotional stakes for Peter, Gwen, and of course, Miles Morales. It's a balancing act that I suspect is much more difficult to pull off than the film makes it look. Because this concept could easily dip into embarrassing Space Jam: A New Legacy territory if not handled well, with a focus on Miles' internal conflict always centered in the narrative. And I think doing well by Miles and Gwen, and to a lesser extent the older Peter, is where the movie really shines narratively. Probably more than any other comic book legacy character of the past 20 years or so, Miles Morales has really come into his own as Spider-Man. He shares many of the traits that made Spider-Man so notable when Peter Parker was created. He's a nervous, often anxiety-filled character who struggles to balance his superhero responsibilities with those to his friends and family. That's the core of what Spider-Man is, and it only makes sense that they'd share that. But these movies, along with some other Miles stories, have done a great job of making him feel truly distinct from Peter as well. Two of the biggest parts of that are his very different family dynamics and the fact that he has to contend with living up to the legacy of Spider-Man, something that was already established when he stepped into the role. Across the Spider-Verse does a great job at honing in on both of those things and mining them for a lot of fantastic moments for Miles. I gotta say, many of my favorite moments in this one were just getting the chance to see this version of Miles do normal Spider-Man stuff, before the multiverse plot really kicks into high gear. I loved his initial battle with the Spot, which is just classic Spider-Man stuff executed really well. Honestly, at some point I'd love to see a Miles-centric Spider-Man movie that doesn't have to center the multiverse stuff, because every taste of it we get here is a lot of fun. I thought the way the movie used the Spot was really clever all around. In my video about the Spider-Man 2 game, I suggested using kind of a forgotten older Spidey bad guy like Will-O-the-Wisp and repurposing him as a major villain for Miles. And while the Spot has never been quite as obscure as that character, what they pull off with him here is kind of the ideal version of that kind of reinvention. Now, this movie wasn't the first time the Spot's powers have been used well. I think he had a few underrated comic book appearances and a pretty cool episode of the 1994 animated show. But this is the first time that he's had an origin story that really lays the groundwork for him being a really substantial villain. The Spot's design and powers have always felt very, very goofy, and his first scene with Miles completely leans into that, acknowledging how hard it is to take this character seriously, and making it seem like he's only going to be there for some early movie punchlines, with his insistence that he's Spider-Man's nemesis coming off as pretty laughable. I thought it was great the way the film was able to completely flip the script, and have Miles unironically call him that near the end, while having it feel completely earned. And I can't wait to see what the next movie ends up doing with him. But alright, I'm avoiding talking about the elephant in the room here. Miguel O'Hara and the giant collection of Spider-Men and women in the movie. I've gone back and forth about how I feel about the second act of this film over and over again, which is tough for me, honestly. I think a lot of the time it seems like YouTube really only wants clear and definitive statements. This movie / scene / character is the best or worst thing ever. No in between. When really, my thoughts on this section of the film may take a little more unpacking than that. I think first and foremost, this was a great story concept for Miles. I especially like this idea that Miguel takes issue with him because he was never supposed to be his universe's Spider-Man. It was a smart way to create a conflict that flows completely naturally from the events of the previous movie, and it sets up the kind of high-concept, emotionally charged sci-fi conundrum that comic book storytelling has done so well through the years. Miles could save his father and risk the destruction of his entire universe, or callously let his father die in order to save everyone else. Now, this kind of thing is pretty well-worn territory, but I think it is a really compelling problem. And I think superhero stories often work best when they're hitting that perfect balance between the highly personal and the big and bombastic. Of course, the sticking point that a lot of fans have, and I think it's a completely understandable one, is that this requires hundreds of Spider people to try to force Miles into letting his dad die. Including, in a real twist of the knife for nerds like me, the Peter from Spectacular Spider-Man. I know I'm hardly the first person to bring this up, but for a lot of Spider-Man fans, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow, as it requires so many versions of the character to basically be disposable foot soldiers for Spider-Man 2099. I can buy many of them thinking that the sacrifice is worth it for the greater good, but I have a harder time believing that they wouldn't at least try to actively help Miles figure out a way to pull off achieving both things. And though there are plenty of ways to rationalize this, at the end of the day, it just didn't sit right with me. It doesn't feel like something that nearly every single version of Peter Parker would fall in line and do. And honestly, the whole concept here I kind of bristled against. Early Spider-Man was partially defined by how poorly he works on teams, having really big falling outs with the Fantastic Four and the Avengers, unable to really embrace being a member of a group like that. But now, there's basically an interdimensional Spider-Man task force that only a few of them, like Spider-Punk, take issue with. And the movie having Miguel be obsessed with maintaining the timeline that he specifically calls the canon seems handcrafted to critique the exact kind of canonical nitpicking that I'm doing right now, which, hey, is a pretty clever move. But overall, I don't think it's a massive deal breaker for me. At the end of the day, these are movies about Miles and Gwen, and they do a very good job at that. I can accept this corner of the Spider-Man universe bending characterizations a bit to suit those stories, but I hope every Spidey just being a cog in the machine for some large spider force doesn't become the default for how this character is used. On a more positive note, I did really like Oscar Isaac's Spider-Man 2099. Sure, this characterization doesn't fit the Miguel of the comics pretty much at all, but I think his traumatic backstory here explains that away just fine. Visually, he looks incredible. I love this version of his costume and his ferocious climbing and fighting style, which provides a perfect visual contrast for Gwen and Miles' nimble and graceful web slinging. And though I take issue with all the other Spider-Man falling in line, his motivations here are really well defined. You can see how he arrived at this point, where he's obsessed with maintaining this timeline, and it's hard to blame the guy for being so intense about wanting to save the lives of billions, even at Miles' expense. Peter B. Parker does kind of get a reduced role this time around, but it was nice to check in with him and Mayday, and see a Peter that, at least for now, has kind of found a happy ending of sorts. My guess is his role as Miles' mentor will only be more important next time around. Now, Gwen's story is a very simple one, with her leaving home and avoiding confronting her dad's discovery. On paper, it's all very straightforward stuff, but what really puts it over the top is just how great Gwen's universe looks and how it conveys the feelings of its characters. And as a comic fan, I loved how it took super direct inspiration from stuff like Robbie Rodriguez's gorgeous 2015 Spider-Gwen #1 cover. Honestly, the way this movie used the comics as inspiration was super refreshing. The MCU also remixes comic book elements, but always from kind of a remove. Across the Spider-Verse wears these inspirations on its sleeve, celebrating these stories in a very direct, unmissable way. And I hope it does drive some more people to finally check out the source material. Oh, and as far as Gwen goes, I think her relationship with Jessica Drew was really interesting and something I didn't see coming. I'm hoping that's expanded on a lot in the next movie. Now, the cliffhanger is something that I see a lot of people up in arms about. And I get it, but it didn't bother me much. For one thing, I knew it was coming. I remember when this movie was originally announced with a Part 1 in its name, so it wasn't exactly shocking. And it feels in line with the comic book arc storytelling that the movie plays into with its numbered covers. Plus, the cliffhanger itself, I think is just really exciting. Alternate Prowler Miles is cool and all, but I'm just happy to see more of Aaron. I loved how he was handled in that first movie, and the fact that he's apparently going to play a big role in the final movie is potentially very exciting. He's a great character, serving as both Miles' Uncle Ben, that family member he couldn't save, but also a really tragic villain in his own right. Overall, Across the Spider-Verse was a pretty incredible watch. I don't think it quite reaches the heights of the first film as a story, but visually it surpasses it and really throws down the gauntlet for nearly every other superhero blockbuster to step up their game in that department. It's a tired old cliche to call one of these movies a love letter to comic books, but I don't think that's ever been more true than it is here. So much of what I love about the medium of comics was up there on the big screen. And though I may have bristled at a couple storytelling choices, it was the best time I've had in a movie theater in a decently long time. Now, a lot is riding on the conclusion of this story next year, but as it is now, Across the Spider-Verse can proudly stand as one of the most inventive and exciting blockbusters in years. So I'm never going to fully grasp the concept of how exactly the multiverse works, but at least I stand a better chance at real math thanks to Brilliant. Seriously, Brilliant does a great job of meeting you where you are when it comes to STEM topics, and letting you tackle them in bite-sized and highly interactive ways. The one I always return to is Math Fundamentals, which hones my skills at the exact kind of math problems that used to frustrate me as someone who wasn't naturally into STEM. Brilliant helps you tackle math, science, and computer science concepts like AI and neural networks in a painless and, dare I say, even fun way. There's thousands of lessons here, with new monthly content always being made available. It's a great way to go from basic to advanced in a lot of these topics, and become a lifelong learner in the process. At the end of the day, it's just a really enjoyable and intuitive way to learn. So go to brilliant.org/midnight and try it out for free for the first 30 days. And also, the first 200 people to go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.